Every year, Which tests thousands of the products that you rely on every day. And we've been doing it for over 60 years.
Which reviews are 100% impartial. We don't accept freebies from manufacturers, and we have no owners, shareholders or government departments to answer to. So our work is on behalf of you, the consumer.
In a world of misleading claims and fake reviews, we test everything, from everyday items to big purchases, so that you don't have to.
We then put them through tests and assessments that go beyond the accepted standard to work out how well these products work for you and what's not worth your money. And a Which membership not only gets you access to our reviews, it also funds our non-profit campaigning work, like getting scam ads banned on social media and ending broadband and mobile mid-contract price hikes. And right now, podcast listeners can become a Which member for 50% off the usual price by heading to which.co.uk/podcast offer. Millions of us are facing huge increases to our council tax bills this month. Is there anything you can do about it? I'm Lucia Ariano, and this is Which Money. Hello and welcome to the show. Now, joining us today, we have Which Money writer Matthew Jenkin.
Hi there.
Hi, Matthew, and also Marcus Johns, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research. Hello, Marcus.
Hello.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. Now, shall we start from the top? I mean, Matthew, this is nothing new, is it? Every year we see bills rise across the board, and council tax, unfortunately, is no exception.
Yeah, that's right. April is everyone's favorite month or least favorite month. It's not just energy and water bills going up, council tax goes up too. But by how much is the question usually. And this year, just like other years, we've seen, or last couple of years, I'd say, we've seen some big increases.
So our listeners, you've probably received a letter in the post, haven't you, saying what your increase will be. Matthew, what's the kind of broader picture? What are some of the headline stats for this year's increases?
Yeah, so just to explain, council tax, how much you pay in council tax depends on where you live and which council tax band your property falls into. But if we look at the bill for an average Band D household, that's gone up by 5% this month. And in terms of pounds and pence, it's adding £109 to the average annual bill. Some areas, though, are going to have seen rates rocket by even more than that, double in some cases. So if you live in Bradford, for example, you're going to be you've no doubt been stung with a 9.99% increase, and that's because the council has particularly stretched finances, and they sought special permission from the government to raise rates above the cap for England, which is set at 4.99%. And let's not forget Scotland and Wales. There are no caps on the amount that local authorities can increase council tax by in those countries. And if you live there, you'll have been hit with rises of 10% or more. Falkirk, for example, Falkirk residents are seeing their bills go up by a whopping 15%. Northern Ireland uses a different system called domestic rates, but rises are also on the way there. Belfast, for example, is seeing the biggest increase of 5.99%. So some really big rises there.
I'm shaking my head as I hear those figures. Marcus, what do you make of it? Are you surprised to see such huge increases?
I think it's not surprising to see most councils using the top of the cap that they're allowed before they trigger a local referendum. As Matthew said, 4.99% rises. And that's because councils have been in financial difficulty for a number of years. They've faced a real increase in the services that they have to deliver, but they have quite little control over some of that spending, like looking after children in care or social care packages for adults under the adult social care system. So they faced big pressures in demand, people using the services. And just like the rest of us, councils have faced inflation over recent years. what we saw during that big spike in inflation following the pandemic was councils facing a level of inflation above the referendum limit, above that 4.99%. So what we're really seeing is the kind of continued wave of that coming through the system. Councils are still out of pocket compared to then and are trying to recuperate that. So it's not a surprise, I think, for councils trying to balance the books. They are required by law to set a balanced budget, that they're at the top of that limit. Where there is some surprises is those councils that have gone above the limit and have applied to central government for that extra ability to raise council tax. There's several councils that have done that, and largely that's to avoid councils technically can't go bankrupt, but they have a particular process that is as similar as you can get, where they have to stop spending on things. And largely to avoid that, we've seen more councils this year apply for that extra support that means they can raise rates above that limit.
This cap you mentioned, Marcus, I'd be really interested to just know a little bit more about, why the cap is in place, and is it really okay that councils are going so far beyond it?
So historically, there wasn't a cap in the way that there is now. I think it was 2012, 2013 when that was introduced. Prior to that, councils just set the Band D rate. So all houses or properties rather are split into these bands from A to H. Councils set that Band D in the middle, and all of the others are worked out based on a ratio for each band. In the past, before 2012-13, councils set a central Band D rate, and it worked its way into council tax bills and into local authority budgets. In 2012-13, the government introduced what's called a referendum cap. So it's split into two parts. So for kind of basic council tax, it's 2.99%, and then there's an extra 2% for adult social care, to recognise that in adult social care, there's been a massive increase in demand and particularly in costs. So combining those two together gives that 4.99%. And if a council wants to raise council tax above that, one option that is available to them is a referendum of local people, a vote for either that above the referendum cap rise, or for an alternative that's below or at the cap. Where these councils are going beyond that, they have applied to government. They've said and had to show their calculations that they're in financial difficulty. They've had to explain the reasons for a lot of them. It is to do with things like overspending budgets in children's social care, where more children have come through the system that need looking after, or those cases of children in the system are more complex. So their bills have risen, and they've put that has put them into financial stress. They've had to show their workings to government, and they've been given that additional council tax rise. For a lot of people, that will be a really difficult increase. You're talking about the hundreds of pounds in some cases. Obviously, outside, as Matthew said earlier, outside of England, their systems are different. And I think what we're seeing in Scotland actually is partly to do with previous freezes. So the Scottish government froze council tax for a number of years. And what I think we are now seeing is that as that cap in Scotland that was essentially at nil has been lifted, councils are now catching up with what we've seen in England over several years of rises, but doing it in one fell swoop. And I think that is going to be a real shock to people who are, probably got quite accustomed to not having their council tax bills rise, to now seeing, as Matthew said, 15.6%, I think, in Falkirk, which is a really significant increase on people who are, as we were saying right at the beginning, already seeing energy bills go up, water bills go up. It kind of is another blow to personal finances.
So shall we hear a few more of the places that have been hit the hardest then, Matthew? We've mentioned a few already. I think Bradford was another one you mentioned earlier. Are there any others that you'd like to flag?
Yeah, we've got Bradford. There's also Windsor and Maidenhead and Newham, as Marcus already mentioned. They're seeing bills rise by 8.99%. We've mentioned Birmingham, 7.5%. Somerset and Trafford, their council tax is also swelling by 7.5%. So there are 6 councils in all that have asked for this special permission and been granted it. Birmingham, for example, was much higher actually last year, was 10%. So, but 7.5% is still a lot, and to see 2 years in a row of those kind of rises, it's really going to hit residents hard.
Absolutely. I mean, 10% one year, then 7.5 the next. That's a huge hit. So it does seem to be quite widespread across England. What about Wales and Scotland, Matthew?
Yeah, so in Wales, Pembrokeshire has the largest bandy increase. That's of 9.2%. I mean, Bridgend, on the other end of the scale, has the smallest rise of 5%. I mean, it's still a lot. And in Scotland, I mentioned Falkirk has the highest of 15.6%. But on average, it's 9.6% rise in council tax in Scotland. And almost half of all the local authorities there are hiking council tax by more than that. So it's going to, again, as Marcus said, people are going to be stretched already as it is with other price rises happening in April. And this is, not welcome news.
I mean, the Scottish average you mentioned there is way above the cap, nearly double. I'm interested, are any councils well below the cap?
I mean, it's not everyone's facing a massive rise, especially in England. There are 7 local authorities. We've got East Cambridgeshire, Fenland, Harlow, Ribble Valley, Ashfield, Mid Suffolk, and Malvern Hills. They're going to see no rise to core council tax and the adult social care precepts. Broadland is actually reducing rates by 0.56%, and Mansfield are going to see the smallest rises. There, the average council tax bill for a Band D is going up by a total of 0.99%. But just because a place it looks like you're not going to get such a massive rise, it doesn't mean that your bills are necessarily the cheapest, because there are other things that added onto your council tax bills, other additional charges, for example, tax set by other organisations such as the parish council or police and crime commissioner. So it's important to also look at the impact those extra charges can have.
We've had a lot of percentages today. Is it possible to kind of bring it back to earth and talk about these increases in pounds and pence?
So we talked about who's got the cheapest, whose rates are going up by the most, whose rates are staying the same or going down. But yeah, if we talk about the actual bill and we look at council tax and the adult social care precepts alone, Breckland actually has the cheapest rates, and residents in this area of Norfolk, they're only going to pay £120.46 per year for a Band D property. That's despite bills rising by 4.33% from this month. But as I said, if we look at all the other charges that get added on top of your bill, they're actually going to be paying £2,328.59. So just think about it, all the other stuff that gets added on. So it's not as cheap as you think. I mean, and if we look at, for example, who's going to be paying the most, Rutland come out top. Their annual Band D bills are going to hit £2,671.01 from April, and that's up from £2,543.29 last year. And that's a rise of 5%.
I mean, it's a huge bill, isn't it? You can't really get away from that. And I just want us to talk a little bit about, I mean, you've probably seen it, our listeners have probably seen it over the media. It's been dubbed this awful April because of all the rises. Marcus, I'd really like to get your take on on what you think about whether, council tax is squeezing households too much, the broader picture here.
One of the things that we've seen over the past decade or so is a real shift in where councils get their funding from. So back in kind of 2009-10, most council funding came from central government grants. And what we've seen since then is a real shift away from central government giving councils funding towards council taxpayers being more and more responsible for their share of council funding. And that has just shifted that burden onto bills, onto people that are obviously facing these other bills going up, as you said, or for April, that range of bills that we all know are going up. So there has been that shift. In other countries, we don't quite see the same reliance on a single tax for places. So in many international comparisons, local government might be funded by 4 or 5 different taxes. So things are a bit more spread out. Whereas in the UK, we've chosen as a country of a kind of successive governments to really focus on one tax. It's also the only tax that any of us receive that arrives as a bill. Income tax doesn't arrive as a bill with the total amount over the year and a breakdown. And I think that also makes council tax feel very different because it does arrive in an envelope as a bill, unlike other forms of tax.
And if we're thinking about what council tax payments are actually paying for, do you think these rises and just the general cost overall, is it justified?
Is it justified? It's a tricky question to answer, partly on the basis that I think for any given council, it often will be very clearly justified. They'll have to set a budget. They'll start from actually setting the budget, all the money they get in, and council tax picks up what the gap is. They call that the council tax requirement. And I suppose it's worth saying that in a lot of these places where people are facing rises above the 5%, or even anywhere that's doing the rise at the limit, that is coming at a time where services won't be going up. The sort of things that we see, like clean streets or spending on roads, that isn't going to be improving because so much of this is about paying off rising costs, but also about those social care services. Around 60% of council spending across the country is now on those sort of services that a lot of people don't see day to day, but are really important social services. I think the problem is that there's too much reliance on councils that are delivering a service, children's and adults care, that they have to provide by law, but is being funded by local taxpayers and not being funded kind of systematically with a fair funding system in England. So there are fundamental unfairnesses in the system, and a lot of councils are kind of picking up that problem, and it is being passed through as high bills to local residents. So I wouldn't necessarily begrudge specific councils, though I know many people will, of course, that the system is pushing it in that direction to pay for really important social services like children in care that I don't think most people would begrudge.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because I also wanted to ask you what the general consensus is of the public. Do we feel like we're getting what we pay for? And as you say, if such a huge proportion is for adult and childcare, while it might be something that you do care about, it might not be something that you actually see the benefit.
And really, over the period where council tax has been rising and more of council's funding has come from council tax as those government funding streams dried up from 2009-10 onwards, people have seen not just services stagnating, but actively being cut back. Libraries closing, leisure centres closing, reductions in hours, even things like being able to speak to a council have become quite challenging because most of them don't have offices that you can attend and speak to someone about your council tax bill, or if you try and call them, it can be very challenging because many services have just been really cut back. So I think there's a really broadly held frustration where people have seen services declining at the same time as bills going up. And that's not, again, there are examples, of course, but that is not largely the fault of any individual council. It is a nationwide problem that we haven't really fixed local government funding, what local government is for and how it should be paid for, as it isn't something that we have collectively resolved. So we've seen this problem of rising bills and declining services. So I think people will be very frustrated by that.
It's a really interesting conversation. I'm really pleased we touched on that. Well, after the break, we'll be looking at ways to reduce your bill and discussing what you can do if you need help with your payments.
If you're enjoying this podcast from us here at Which, then why not become a Which member? Right now, we've got a special offer, especially for podcast listeners, meaning you can choose any of our 3 membership tiers for 50% off the usual price. Starting at just £39.50 for a full year, you can get Which magazine delivered direct to your door. For the same price, you could also choose a digital Which subscription, giving you access to all of our product reviews, the Which app, and the digital edition of Which magazine. What's more, you'll also be able to use the Ask Which service for personalised one-to-one buying advice. Or why not get a full access Which subscription for just £49.50 for a full year? Don't forget, that's 50% off the usual price. To join Which or to find out more, just head to which.co.uk/podcast offer. That's which.co.uk/podcast offer, or click the link in the description for today's podcast for 50% off a Which annual subscription.
Now, I wouldn't be surprised if some of your first thoughts when you hear about these rises could be, how can I reduce my bill? Matthew, shall we start with who is exempt from paying council tax?
There is a long list, but to pick out a few examples, if you're a full-time student, obviously only people who are aged over 18. You could be a member of the armed forces, and my personal favorite is if you are a nun or a monk, and if you're detained in prison. So there is quite a long list. So it's if you think you do qualify for an exemption, you should get in touch with your local council and make your case.
Well, I should say that we'll pop a few links in the description of today's episode for any of these exemptions and useful resources. And there is a 25% discount that some people might be able to get. So how does this work, Matthew?
So if you're not exempt, you could apply for a discount, but obviously that doesn't apply to everyone. This 25% discount is for people who live alone or with others who are disregarded for council tax purposes, as I mentioned, if you're a full-time student, etc. Again, you'll have to apply through your council for that, and we have lots more information on our websites if you want to know if you qualify.
Full-time student is always one that I think people don't know enough. I certainly feel like a few people I know have missed out on a council tax reduction, not knowing that one. And I'm going to come in again, Marcus, with a difficult question. A 25% discount, I mean, it is good, but we've heard the bills people are paying, are having to pay. Is 25%, does it cut it? Is it enough?
So you are right. That is absolutely a really interesting question. So the reason why it's 25% is that when council tax was reduced, it was considered that half of the council tax was paid on the property and half of the council tax was paid on the people that live there. And it's assuming that there's two people in your property. So 25% is just half of half. And that is where the 25% comes from. And we've never revisited it. So, I think that we need quite broad council tax reform. The system doesn't work. Our bills are all going up constantly. It's not very fair across the country, as we've heard. And actually, a lot of places that are putting council tax up by quite high percentages don't actually receive quite a lot of money from that, compared to some places that will have a much lower rise, but actually the council's income goes up by a much higher amount because of the way that bands work. So the system doesn't really work very well overall, and we haven't revisited those things. So I think absolutely we should have a discussion. Is that 25% still the right amount? It feels very low to a lot of people, but that kind of is where it comes from, that half of half idea when council tax was introduced.
I was just going to add another rule, other kind of reductions that you can get. Empty properties, for example, such as second homes and holiday homes. But again, if you think your property fits that bill, then you need to write to the council and make your case. So that's another way to get a reduction.
And it's probably just worth flagging on that one that there are premiums in some places on those. So empty or second homes, in some places pay double council tax rather than it attracting a discount.
Well, I'm really pleased that Marcus, a moment ago, you mentioned the argument for reform, because I also wanted to mention before we wrap up today about challenging your council tax band. And I feel like there's a lot of talk about council tax bands maybe being quite antiquated. If you think you might like to challenge your council tax band, I mean, it can be risky, firstly, can't it?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, This is the way council tax bands work. The more expensive the property, the higher the band. In England and Scotland, bands are based on the price the property would have sold for in 1991. Wales uses 2003 prices, and Northern Ireland uses 2005 prices. But in some cases, the original valuation of your home might have been wrong, or you might have made changes to your property's use or size since its valuation. For example, you might have renovated, and that might have altered the band it should sit in. So if you think you have a case, then yes, you can appeal, and you might get pushed down to a lower band and pay less council tax as a result. But it's also possible that you could be reclassified into a higher band, which would increase your bills. So there is a risk to this. And for example, on my street, I actually thought, oh, I wonder, what band I'm in. Maybe we can get a reduction as well. And I looked, and everybody is actually on the same band except for one house, one property, which is on a much lower band. And they seem to have slipped through the net. So if they actually appealed, it's very, very likely they're going to end up paying more. So probably should keep quiet. But so you should do your research first. Just ask around the street, ask your neighbours, and see what other people are paying before you do, because there is that risk that you could just end up paying more as a result. So shoot yourself in the foot a little.
And Marcus, yeah, you're nodding and smiling. I mean, was there anything you'd add to that about how to research or how to challenge?
Absolutely. I mean, there are definitely errors in the system when they were setting these bans on these property values. It was the first time they were evaluating the cost, the price of property across the whole country, and some of it was done by drive-by estate agents in cars ticking lists as they went. So there's lots of scope to look at the system. All council tax bands are publicly available. You can put a postcode in on the Valuation Office website. You can look at what bands people pay, and exactly as Matthew says, you can compare to your neighbours, to similar houses, to your own, and understand your band. It is worth bearing in mind that when we're talking about what people will pay, we talk about band D because that's what council set. And the average band D council tax in the year to come is about £2,300. But the actual average that will be paid by the average house is around £1,800 because most people are below band D. So it is quite a substantial amount to move down a band. You're probably not going to move from F down to B. Is probably more going to be a marginal adjustment that the Valuation Office would make, because it's not actually the council that decide your bands. It's a different agency, a central government agency called the Valuation Office Agency.
It's such a big beast, isn't it? There's so many layers to council tax. I mean, just before we kind of wrap up for today, if anyone listening is feeling like their council tax is very unaffordable, or they know somebody who might be feeling that way, is there any further support that they can get?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, if you don't pay your council tax bill, you can get in some serious trouble. So if you don't pay, for example, if you don't pay after receiving a final notice, your council can take legal action, and that includes getting your employer to pay your unpaid tax directly from your wages, or even sending in the bailiffs. If everything else fails, you can be taken to court and even face prison time. So if you can pay it off, do it. But otherwise, if you really are struggling, there are several things you can do. Contact your council, ask about reducing, as we've mentioned, look at rescheduling payments. You're going to have to provide some evidence for that, savings, earnings, other assets that can't cover what you owe. There's also a hardship relief, and this can help if you experience what they classify as exceptional hardship beyond your control. And as we mentioned, you can apply for a council tax reduction if you think it applies to you. That depends on where you live, and you could also be eligible if you're on a low income or receive benefits. So there are options, but just, the worst thing if you really are struggling, is to just sit there and do nothing. You do need to take action.
And finally, then, it's cropped up quite a bit over the course of the show, the potential need for reform, but also what a huge beast council tax is. Marcus, is there anything being done at the moment to bring rising costs under control, or fully reform?
There are a lot of discussions, and there have been for a long time, going on about council tax reform. It is a very difficult one to fix. It's very politically challenging for any government. It is a very complicated tax, as we've been talking about today. Those different support schemes that Matthew mentioned are different in different councils, who's eligible for them. So it's a very complicated tax to try to resolve. From an IPPR perspective, we would like to see council tax reform. We'd like to see a much fairer system, because one of the things that does happen with those bans is that the amount that is paid in the bands actually goes up more slowly than the value of the property does. And because there's a top band at band H, essentially that band now covers pretty normal family homes in some places, and also multi-million-pound mansions that are all just left in this top band. So there's lots of bits of the system that are very unfair. If you live in the Northeast, the amount of your property as a percentage that you would pay each year is double the amount that someone in London would pay, because the system just bakes in these unfairnesses in relation to property value. So we would like to see a system that's just more fairly reflective of property values, that would rebalance things around the country. Actually, it would probably make it a much fairer system in terms of place, as well as for the people that are paying it. And there are kind of things that can be done. Wales revalued all of their properties a few years ago, and is planning to do another revaluation. The properties were valued before I was born in England. It's increasingly absurd, really, that we're using 1991 property values to decide how much you pay. So yes, it's complicated, and there's big ideas for reform and replacing it. There's also things that can be done, like revaluation, like looking at the bands and the very top end in particular.
Well, it's been a brilliant show, much food for thought. Thank you both, Marcus and Matthew. It's been brilliant to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Which, the UK's consumer champion. You can find plenty more advice about what we discussed today in the show notes. There you'll also find a link to become a Which member for 50% off the usual price, an offer exclusively available to you, our podcast listeners. Joining Which will not only give you access to our product reviews, our app, one-to-one personalised buying advice, and every issue of Which magazine across the year, but you'll also be helping us to make life simpler, fairer and safer for everyone. Don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. That way you'll be notified whenever we release a new episode of Which Money, Which Shorts, or any other podcast that we make for you. And if you want to get in touch with us, then follow us on social media at Which UK, or drop us an email to podcast@which.co.uk. See you next time.
Leaking roof? Car won't start? Needs to renovate? Here's what to look for when getting a trader to help. A recognised endorsement, where expert assessors set the bar high. Genuine customer reviews, so you don't get duped by cowboy fakers. A clear code of conduct to give you an extra layer of security. A robust complaints policy, so you can resolve disputes fairly. And the Which Trusted Trader badge that says, choose me with confidence. You can trust Which to help you find the right traders for the job. We run thorough checks on traders, put them through in-depth assessments, then we give them the actions to make improvements and only endorse them when they've actioned them and made the grade. So, to choose with confidence, head to which.co.uk/traders or search for Which Trusted Traders.